Imagine a life lived in the opulent shadows of ancient Rome, a world of marble and gold, of power and prestige, yet a life perpetually on the periphery. This is not the story of the revered Roman matron, the dignified wife whose lineage and virtue were celebrated. No, this is the untold narrative, the hushed whispers of those who existed in a precarious space between freedom and servitude, between acceptance and scorn. This is the story of the Roman concubine, a figure often overlooked in the grand tapestries of history, yet whose existence was woven with threads of profound endurance, silent suffering, and horrifying unspoken rituals. For centuries, our understanding of Roman society has been dominated by the idealized image of the Roman family, the pater familias, the dutiful wife, the legitimate children. But beneath this polished veneer of tradition and law lay a complex, often brutal reality. Roman society, like many ancient civilizations, was a landscape of stark hierarchies, where status dictated destiny, and where the lines between legal union and illicit liaison were often blurred, yet profoundly impactful. It was within this intricate web of social stratification that the concubine found her place, a place defined not by legal recognition or familial honour, but by a fragile, often temporary arrangement with a man of higher standing. Their lives were a paradox. They were often women of beauty, intelligence and charm, chosen by powerful men for companionship, pleasure, and sometimes even affection. Yet, they were denied the fundamental rights and protections afforded to a legal wife. They could not inherit. Their children often bore the stigma of illegitimacy, and their very presence in a household was a constant reminder of their subordinate status. They were, in essence, living embodiments of a man's desires, objects of convenience, whose worth was measured not by their intrinsic value as human beings, but by their utility and their ability to maintain the favour of their patron. This narrative will pull back the veil on these shadowed lives, delving into the unspoken realities, the daily indignities, and the profound psychological toll of existing in such a liminal space. We will explore not just the legal definitions of concubinage, but the lived experience, the emotional landscape, and the horrifying, often invisible rituals of subservience that defined their existence. These were not formal ceremonies, no grand public spectacles, but rather the insidious repetitive acts of dehumanization, the constant performance of a role that demanded the suppression of self, the quiet acceptance of their fate. Prepare to journey beyond the romanticized notions of ancient Rome, beyond the triumphs and the emperors, into the intimate, often brutal confines of the Roman household. We will confront the uncomfortable truths about power dynamics, the exploitation of vulnerability, and the enduring human capacity for both cruelty and quiet resilience. This is a story that demands our attention, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a stark reflection of timeless struggles for dignity, autonomy, and recognition. It is a narrative that will challenge your perceptions, provoke your empathy, and leave you with a haunting understanding of the horrifying rituals Roman concubines had to endure. Rituals that etched themselves not onto stone, but onto the very souls of these forgotten women. To truly comprehend the plight of the Roman concubine, one must first navigate the intricate and often contradictory legal and social landscape of ancient Rome. Unlike the clear-cut institution of matrimonium or legal marriage, concubinage, known as concubinatus, occupied a nebulous, ill-defined space. It was not, in the eyes of Roman law, a formal union, yet it was far from a casual affair or mere prostitution. It was a recognized, albeit subordinate, form of cohabitation, a relationship that was monogamous and intended to be long-lasting, but crucially lacked the legal and social protections afforded to a wife. The distinction was paramount, and it was codified, albeit loosely, by various Roman laws, most notably the Augustan marriage legislation of the late 1st century BC and early 1st century AD. These laws, enacted by Emperor Augustus to promote marriage, and legitimate offspring among the Roman elite, inadvertently solidified the legal standing of concubinage by defining what marriage was not. If a couple could not, or chose not to, enter into a legal marriage, perhaps due to differences in social status, or because one party was already married, concubinage offered a legitimate alternative for cohabitation. It was a pragmatic solution for a society obsessed with order and status, allowing for stable relationships without violating the strictures of formal marriage or incurring the penalties associated with illicit sexual liaisons. Yet this legal recognition did not equate to social equality. A concubine, regardless of her personal qualities or the affection her partner might hold for her, could never achieve the social standing of a matrona, a Roman wife. The matrona was the mistress of the household, the mother of legitimate children who would inherit their father's name and property, and a figure of respect within Roman society. The concubine, by contrast, remained perpetually in the shadows, her status precarious, her future uncertain. Her children, while not considered spurious, bastards in the most derogatory sense, were still naturales, natural children, and could not inherit directly from their father unless specifically willed to do so, and even then, their inheritance was often limited. This fundamental difference in legal and social standing created an unbridgeable chasm between the wife and the concubine, a chasm that defined every aspect of the latter's existence. The reasons for entering into concubinage were varied, often reflecting the rigid social stratification of Roman society. For men of senatorial or equestrian rank, marriage to a woman of lower social standing was forbidden by law, as it would dilute their noble lineage. Yet they might form deep attachments to freedwomen or women from the lower classes. Concubinage provided a loophole, allowing them to maintain a stable domestic arrangement without compromising their social standing or violating legal prohibitions. For soldiers, who were often forbidden from marrying during their active service, concubinage offered a practical solution for companionship and family life, with the understanding that such relationships would be formalized into marriage upon their discharge or dissolved. For men who already had a wife but desired additional companionship or sexual partners without the legal complexities of divorce or the social stigma of outright adultery, a concubine was a convenient and often socially acceptable alternative. It was a way to maintain appearances while indulging personal desires, a testament to the double standards that permeated Roman society. But what of the women who became concubines? Their origins were diverse, yet almost universally placed them in a position of vulnerability. Many were slaves, either purchased specifically for this purpose or already part of a wealthy household. For a slave, becoming a concubine, even without the full rights of a wife, could represent a significant improvement in her life. It might mean release from arduous labour, access to better food and clothing, and even the possibility of manumission, freedom, if she pleased her master. However, this freedom was always conditional, dependent entirely on the master's whim. Freed women, women who had been slaves but were granted their freedom, often found themselves in concubinage. They lacked the social connections and dowries necessary to secure a legal marriage with a man of means, and concubinage offered a path to economic stability and a degree of social acceptance. Some concubines were freeborn women from the lower classes, whose families lacked the resources or status to arrange a suitable marriage. For them, concubinage might be a desperate measure to secure protection and sustenance in a society that offered few opportunities for independent women. Regardless of her origin, the concubine's life was characterized by a profound lack of agency. She was, in essence, an appendage to her male partner, her existence defined by his needs and desires. She had no legal standing to demand support, no right to inherit, and no claim to her children beyond what her partner chose to grant. Her position was entirely dependent on the man's continued favour, a precarious existence that could be shattered at any moment. If he tired of her, if a more suitable wife appeared, or if his family disapproved, she could be cast aside with little to no recourse. This absolute dependence, this constant awareness of her vulnerability, formed the bedrock of the horrifying rituals she was forced to endure, rituals not of ceremony, but of silent daily submission to a power that could, and often did, define her entire world. Within the confines of the Roman household, the concubine's life unfolded as a series of unspoken rituals, a daily performance of subservience that etched itself onto her very being. These were not the grand public ceremonies of state or religion, but rather the insidious repetitive acts of a life lived in the shadows, where every gesture, every word, every moment was dictated by her precarious position. Her existence was a constant negotiation of boundaries, a delicate dance between fulfilling her master's expectations and navigating the treacherous currents of household politics, especially when a legal wife was present. Her domestic duties, while often mirroring those of a wife, carried a different weight. She might oversee the household slaves, manage daily provisions, or even supervise the education of children, her own or those of the legal wife. Yet, unlike the matrona, whose authority stemmed from her legal standing and her role as the mother of legitimate heirs, the concubine's influence was entirely derivative, a reflection of her master's favour. She was a manager without true power, a caretaker without inherent respect. Her efforts, no matter how diligent, were rarely acknowledged as contributions to the family unit, but rather as extensions of her master's will. She might spend hours meticulously arranging flowers, preparing elaborate meals, or ensuring the smooth running of the household, only for her efforts to be taken for granted, or worse, to be seen as an overstepping of her bounds by a jealous wife or disapproving in-laws. This constant striving for approval, this unending performance of domestic perfection, was a ritual of unseen toil, a labour of love and fear that rarely yielded genuine appreciation. Perhaps the most defining and often horrifying ritual of the concubine's life was her sexual obligation. She was, by definition, a sexual partner, and her body was not entirely her own. While a legal wife's sexual relations were primarily for procreation and the continuation of the family line, a concubine's role often extended to fulfilling her master's desires without the same marital sanctity. This meant a constant state of sexual availability, a readiness to respond to his whims, regardless of her own feelings or comfort. There was no concept of consent as we understand it today. Her status as a concubine, particularly if she was a slave or freedwoman, implied an inherent obligation to her master's sexual demands. This unspoken ritual of sexual subservience could manifest in various ways, from intimate encounters to being presented to guests or associates, a chilling display of her master's power and her own lack of agency. The psychological impact of this constant vulnerability, this perpetual awareness that her body was a commodity, must have been immense, eroding her sense of self and leaving her with a profound feeling of dehumanization. Beyond the physical, the concubine was subjected to an intense form of emotional labor. She was expected to be a source of comfort, companionship, and emotional support for her master, to anticipate his moods, soothe his frustrations, and provide an escape from the pressures of his public life. This required a constant vigilance, a careful calibration of her words and actions to maintain his favour. She had to be empathetic without being demanding, affectionate without being possessive, and understanding without being judgmental. This emotional tightrope walk was particularly perilous if her master had a legal wife. The concubine was often forced to navigate a complex web of unspoken rules, to remain invisible when necessary, to avoid any action that might provoke the wife's jealousy or anger. She might be a confidant in private but a ghost in public, her existence acknowledged only in hushed tones or knowing glances. This constant suppression of her own emotions, this performance of emotional neutrality, was a ritual of self-denial, a silent sacrifice of her inner world for the sake of her precarious position. The children born to a concubine occupied a particularly precarious position within Roman society. While not legally illegitimate in the same way as children born from casual liaisons, they were still naturals, natural children, distinct from the legitimi born of a legal marriage. This distinction carried significant implications for their inheritance rights and social standing. While a father could acknowledge and even provide for his naturals' children, they did not automatically inherit his name or property. Their future was entirely dependent on his goodwill and his willingness to make provisions for them, often through a will. This meant that a concubine's hope for her children's future was inextricably linked to her ability to maintain her master's affection and influence him to act in their favour. This created an additional layer of emotional burden, a constant anxiety about their security and prospects, knowing that their fate rested on such fragile foundations. The presence of a legal wife introduced another layer of horrifying ritual, the constant threat of cruelty and humiliation. The wife, secure in her legal standing and her social superiority, often viewed the concubine as a rival, a threat to her husband's affections and her own position within the household. While Roman law generally prohibited a man from having both a wife and a concubine simultaneously, though this was often circumvented, the reality was that many men did. This created an environment ripe for tension, jealousy, and abuse. The wife might subject the concubine to verbal abuse, public humiliation, or even physical violence, knowing that the concubine had little recourse. She might assign her demeaning tasks, deny her basic comforts, or actively work to undermine her relationship with the master. The concubine, in turn, was often forced to endure these indignities in silence, knowing that any retaliation or complaint could lead to her immediate dismissal, or worse. This ritual of silent endurance, this acceptance of her subordinate status, was a daily reminder of her vulnerability and the vast power imbalance that defined her life. Ultimately, the concubine's existence was one of profound invisibility. Her life was largely confined to the private sphere of the household, rarely acknowledged in public life. She did not participate in the social gatherings of the elite. She did not attend public ceremonies as a recognized partner, and her name was rarely spoken in polite society. She was a hidden figure, a secret kept within the walls of the home, her contributions uncelebrated, her suffering unseen. This ritual of public erasure, this constant suppression of her own identity, meant that for many Roman concubines, their lives were lived in a perpetual twilight, a shadowy existence where their very humanity was often denied, leaving behind little more than whispers in the vast silent corridors of history. Beyond the daily indignities and the constant performance of subservience, the Roman concubine endured a deeper, more insidious form of suffering, the psychological and physical horrors that often remained unspoken, unacknowledged, and unpunished. These were not mere inconveniences, but profound assaults on her personhood, systematically eroding her identity and autonomy, leaving her vulnerable to the whims of a society that viewed her as little more than property. One of the most devastating aspects of a concubine's life was the systematic erosion of her personal identity. From the moment she entered into such an arrangement, her life ceased to be her own. Her desires, her aspirations, her very sense of self became secondary to the needs and desires of her master. If she was a slave, her identity was already largely stripped away, replaced by her status as chattel. If she was a freed woman, or a freeborn woman of lower status. The transition into concubinage often meant shedding her previous life, her family connections, and her personal ambitions. She was expected to adapt to her master's household, to adopt his customs, and to become an extension of his will. Her name might even be changed, or she might be referred to by a generic term, further diminishing her individuality. This constant suppression of self, this forced assimilation into another's world was a profound psychological torment, a ritual of self-erasure that left many concubines feeling like ghosts in their own lives. The physical vulnerability of a concubine was a constant, terrifying reality. Unlike a legal wife who had some, albeit limited, legal protections against abuse, a concubine, particularly if she was a slave, had virtually none. She was considered her master's property, and he had almost absolute power over her body. This meant the constant threat of physical violence, whether in a fit of rage, as a form of punishment, or simply as an assertion of dominance. A slap, a kick, a beating. These were not just possibilities, but often realities with little to no legal recourse. There was no one to whom she could appeal, no court that would hear her case, no authority that would intervene on her behalf. Her cries would likely go unheard, or worse, be dismissed as the tantrums of a disobedient servant. This constant fear, this knowledge that her body was not her own and could be subjected to violence at any moment, was a horrifying ritual of daily terror, a silent endurance that shaped her every interaction and decision. Beyond overt physical abuse, concubines were often subjected to subtle, yet equally damaging forms of emotional manipulation and control. Their masters might foster a sense of dependence, showering them with gifts and affection one moment, only to withdraw it the next, keeping them in a perpetual state of anxiety and longing for approval. They might be isolated from their families and friends, their social circles deliberately curtailed, making them entirely reliant on their master for companionship and emotional support. This created a psychological trap, where the concubine, despite the hardships, might cling to the relationship out of fear of abandonment or a desperate need for affection. The master's power extended not just over her body, but over her mind, subtly shaping her perceptions, her desires, and her very sense of worth. This insidious control, this ritual of psychological subjugation, left many concubines feeling trapped, their spirits slowly crushed by the weight of their circumstances. The social isolation experienced by many concubines was another unspoken horror. They existed in a liminal space, not fully integrated into the master's family, yet separated from their own. They were often ostracized by legal wives, who viewed them as rivals and threats, and by other women of higher social standing, who saw them as morally inferior. They could not participate in the social gatherings of the elite, nor could they fully integrate back into their original social circles, having been tainted by their association with a powerful man. This meant a life of profound loneliness, a constant feeling of being an outsider, an uninvited guest in her own home. The only person she could truly rely on was her master, yet he was also the source of her vulnerability. This ritual of social exclusion, this enforced solitude, was a heavy burden, leaving many concubines with a deep sense of alienation and despair. Perhaps one of the most chilling aspects of a concubine's life, though less documented in explicit detail, was the potential for forced medical procedures. While direct evidence is scarce, some concubines were probably subjected to interventions aimed at controlling their reproductive capabilities or maintaining their physical appearance. In a society where male heirs were paramount, and where the children of concubines held a lower legal status, it is conceivable that masters might have forced abortions or contraception upon their concubines to prevent unwanted pregnancies, or to ensure that their legitimate wives were the sole bearers of their primary heirs. Similarly, in a culture that valued youthful beauty, concubines might have been subjected to painful or dangerous procedures to maintain their appearance, to delay the onset of aging, or to recover quickly from childbirth, all to ensure their continued appeal to their master. These were not medical treatments for their well-being, but rather brutal interventions designed to serve the master's interests, turning the concubine's body into a tool to be manipulated and controlled. These unspoken rituals, hidden behind the closed doors of the Roman household, represent a horrifying violation of bodily autonomy, a testament to the extreme lengths to which power could be exercised over the vulnerable, And then there was the unspoken, yet ever-present ritual of sexual degradation. While concubinage was a recognized institution, it did not preclude the possibility of extreme sexual exploitation. While not a formal ritual in the sense of a formal ceremony, the constant sexual availability and the potential for extreme forms of sexual exploitation constituted a horrifying, unspoken ritual of their existence. Concubines, particularly those who were slaves, could be forced to participate in orgies, to entertain guests, or even to be loaned out to others at their master's whim. This was not about affection or even pleasure, but about the assertion of absolute power, a public display of ownership that further dehumanized the concubine. Her body became a stage for her master's desires, a tool for his social maneuvering, and a canvas for his depravity. The psychological scars left by such experiences would have been profound and lasting, a constant reminder of her lack of control over her being, a perpetual violation of her most intimate self. This ritual of degradation, often hidden from public view, was a silent scream, a testament to the depths of human cruelty and the utter vulnerability of those without power. Finally, perhaps the most pervasive and terrifying ritual endured by Roman concubines was the ever-present fear of discard. Their position, unlike that of a legal wife, was inherently unstable. There was no legal contract binding her master to her, no social obligation to maintain her, and no legal recourse if he chose to cast her aside. This meant a constant gnawing anxiety, a perpetual awareness that her security, her livelihood, and even her very survival depended entirely on the fickle affections of one man. As she aged, as her beauty faded, or as her master's interest shifted, the threat of being replaced by a younger, more appealing woman loomed large. She could be sold, abandoned, or simply dismissed, left to fend for herself in a society that offered few safety nets for women without male protection. This fear was not just about economic hardship, it was about the complete erasure of her life, the nullification of her sacrifices, and the terrifying prospect of a future devoid of purpose or protection. This ritual of uncertainty, this constant dance on the precipice of abandonment, shaped every decision, every interaction, and every moment of her life, leaving her in a perpetual state of psychological siege, a silent testament to the brutal realities of power and vulnerability in ancient Rome. While the narrative of the Roman concubine is overwhelmingly one of subjugation and suffering, history, in its vast and intricate tapestry, occasionally reveals threads of defiance, moments of unexpected influence, and even rare instances where these women, against all odds, managed to carve out a semblance of agency. These exceptions, though few and far between, offer a crucial counterpoint to the pervasive despair, reminding us that even in the most oppressive systems, the human spirit can find ways to assert itself, however subtly. One of the most compelling, albeit rare scenarios, was when a concubine managed to gain significant influence over her master, sometimes even rivaling the power of a legal wife. This was not achieved through legal means, but through sheer force of personality, intelligence, or an undeniable emotional bond. Such women often possessed a keen understanding of their master's temperament, his ambitions, and his vulnerabilities. They became trusted confidants, advisors, and even political strategists their counsel sought and valued. While they might not have held formal power, their informal influence could be immense, shaping decisions that affected not just the household, but sometimes even the broader political landscape. These were the women who, through their wit and charm, managed to transcend their precarious status, transforming themselves from mere objects of desire into indispensable companions. Their power was always contingent, always dependent on their master's continued affection, but for a time they could wield a subtle yet potent authority that belied their legal standing. Children born of concubinage, despite their initial disadvantage, sometimes managed to achieve prominence. While they lacked the automatic inheritance rights of legitimate children, a loving or ambitious father could make provisions for them in his will, ensuring their education and financial security. In some cases, if a man had no legitimate male heirs, or if his legitimate children proved unworthy, the children of a concubine might even be adopted or elevated to a position of importance. History records instances where such individuals, through their own talents or the continued patronage of their fathers, rose to positions of influence in Roman society, serving in the military, engaging in commerce, or even entering the lower ranks of the aristocracy. Their success was a testament not only to their abilities, but also to the complex and sometimes fluid nature of Roman social mobility, where individual merit, combined with powerful patronage, could occasionally overcome the stigma of birth. Perhaps the most significant glimmer of agency for a concubine was the possibility of gaining freedom and establishing a life beyond the confines of her master's household. For slave concubines, manumission, the act of being freed, was the ultimate aspiration. This could be granted by the master during his lifetime, or stipulated in his will upon his death. Once freed, a woman could, in theory, marry, own property, and live an independent life. However, even freedom came with its own set of limitations. Freed women often remained bound by ties of patronage to their former masters, owing them respect and specific services. Their social standing, while improved, was still lower than that of freeborn citizens, and their past as a concubine might forever mark them. Yet, for many, the taste of freedom, however circumscribed, was a profound liberation, offering the chance to escape the daily rituals of subservience and to forge a life, however modest, on their terms. Historical accounts, though sparse and often biased, also offer tantalizing glimpses of concubines who, in their ways, resisted their fate. This resistance rarely took the form of open rebellion, which would have been suicidal. Instead, it manifested in subtle acts of defiance, in the preservation of their inner world, in the quiet refusal to be entirely consumed by their circumstances. It might be a slave concubine who secretly practiced her ancestral religion, maintaining a connection to her heritage despite her forced assimilation. It might be a freed woman who, upon gaining her freedom, meticulously saved her earnings to ensure her children would never suffer the same fate. These were not grand gestures, but quiet acts of self-preservation, moments where the concubine, despite the overwhelming pressures, asserted her humanity and her will. These glimmers of agency, however faint, remind us that even in the darkest corners of history, the human spirit, in its indomitable quest for dignity, can find ways to endure, to resist, and to reclaim a piece of itself from the jaws of oppression. As we draw this journey into the shadowed lives of Roman concubines to a close, we are left with a profound and often unsettling understanding of a segment of ancient society frequently relegated to the footnotes of history. Their existence, defined by a complex interplay of legal ambiguity, social stigma, and absolute dependence, was a testament to the harsh realities of power dynamics in the Roman world. The horrifying rituals they endured were not always the dramatic public spectacles of the arena, but rather the insidious daily acts of psychological and physical subjugation, the constant performance of a role that demanded the suppression of self and the quiet acceptance of their precarious fate. We have seen how concubinage, while a legally recognized form of cohabitation, stood in stark contrast to the esteemed institution of Roman marriage. This distinction, rooted in social hierarchy and the pursuit of legitimate heirs, created a liminal space where women, often of beauty and intelligence, were stripped of fundamental rights and protections. Their daily lives were a meticulous dance of domestic duties performed without authority, sexual obligations fulfilled without agency, and emotional labour expended without genuine reciprocity. The children they bore, though acknowledged, carried the stigma of their irregular birth, their futures perpetually uncertain, dependent on the whims of a father who could at any moment choose to disregard them. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of their endurance was the psychological and physical toll. The systematic erosion of identity, the constant threat of violence with no legal recourse, the insidious emotional manipulation that fostered dependence, and the profound social isolation they faced. These were the true horrors. And while direct historical accounts of forced medical procedures are scarce, the logical implications of a society that viewed these women as property suggest a chilling reality of bodily autonomy denied, of lives controlled to serve the master's convenience. The ever-present fear of discard, of being cast aside when their youth or appeal faded, was a constant psychological torment, a ritual of uncertainty that shaped every moment of their existence. Yet, amidst this pervasive darkness, we found glimmers of resilience, rare instances where concubines, through sheer force of will or unexpected circumstance, managed to carve out a semblance of agency. The few who gained influence, whose children rose to prominence, or who eventually achieved freedom, remind us that even in the most oppressive systems, the human spirit can find ways to assert itself. The legacy of Roman concubinage extends far beyond the ancient world. It serves as a powerful historical mirror, reflecting timeless struggles for bodily autonomy, the insidious nature of power imbalances, and the devastating impact of exploitation. The stories of these women, often silenced by the dominant narratives of history, resonate with contemporary issues of human trafficking, gender inequality, and the ongoing fight for fundamental human rights. Their experiences remind us that the abuse of power, in any era, leaves an indelible stain, and that the human cost of such systems is immeasurable. In remembering the horrifying rituals Roman concubines had to endure, we are not merely recounting a dark chapter of history. We are bearing witness to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. We are acknowledging the unseen lives, the unheard whispers, and the profound suffering that often lies beneath the surface of grand historical narratives. Their story, though tragic, is a powerful reminder that every individual life, regardless of social standing or historical context, possesses an inherent worth that demands recognition and respect.